All right. Well, before we get into, we're going to talk both college football and the NFL. Before we do that, just want to remind everybody that our viewers that we are now over 400 subscribers on the channel. We just reached that mark, and our next goal obviously is 500. So we want to get to 500. We'd love to get to 1,000 before the end of the football season. So please subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Again, our next goal is 500. Hopefully, we'll reach that in the next week or two. Let's talk. I do want to bring up college football. You guys were talking, I believe, about some of these overtime matchups, and I do want to bring up what happened late last Saturday night on the West Coast, as Arizona came oh so close again from winning a big game, and they lost that one in overtime. Are you guys okay? I'll start with Jim. Jim, are you okay with the new overtime rule where you go from, obviously you get the ball at the 25, 20, whatever it is, and then after you score a touchdown, the second possession, you have to go for 2 if you get a touchdown, but then after that, you go for 2 points. Are you okay with going in that third possession right for the 2-point play?
Well, first of all, there is no right answer. The way it was in the past, I mean, you could have an all night long overtime game. I mean, back and forth. They had to find the way to cut it short, just like they did in baseball with the pitch clock and things like that. At some point, you got to make an adjustment, and some of these adjustments are questionable. But as long as it's fair for both teams, I don't have a problem with it. If somebody comes up with a genius method to make it better, I'm all for that too. But I'm okay with it because it is fair for both teams.
Andy, you okay with that, or would you come up with something if you were in charge?
Well, I'll comment first about one of the points Jim made about as long as it's fair. The NFL finally wised up and allowed in the playoffs now that if the first team scores a touchdown, you get an opportunity to match it, and then it becomes sudden death. But they still don't do that in regulation for determining teams that might or not make the playoffs or make the playoffs. If the Patriots move down the field and score a touchdown, the opponent should be able to match that. Then if you want to start talking about overtime or sudden death, that's one thing. But both teams will at least had a chance to match what the other team did. As far as the college rule goes, let's go back about 30 years when if games ended in ties, they ended in ties, and people started saying it's not fair and we need to have a winner and all that. And that's fine. I did not mind when I didn't really like the fact that they didn't use an NFL version time overtime and they started this gimmick with the 25-yard line. Okay, we've gotten used to it. It's okay. Both teams have a chance. I can understand we had that 7 or 8 overtime game sometime within the last decade. I want to see Tennessee and Arkansas, some teams like that. Tennessee seems to be involved in a lot of those long overtime games, but now they've changed it. I would like to see 2, maybe 3 alternating possessions where you start at the 25 before you start going to, we just have to end this game. We'll go to the 2-point conversion. That's almost like, at least the NHL, if I remember correctly, and Mark, you might remember this, they started with a 5-minute overtime and then went to a 10-minute overtime, and then they instituted the shootout. Well, the 2-point conversion thing is just like going to a shootout. It's like going to penalty kicks to decide World Cup matches once you get past the group play. There's the balance between the number of plays, the length of the game, rather, and getting a winner determined. And to a secondary, the more plays you put out, the more you're exposing players to injury. And a lot's been made. Well, this team played a 3 overtime game last week in college. They're going to be, first of all, they're young kids. Number 2, a 3 overtime game might involve an additional 15 plays. For each side, because you're going from the 25-yard line, and maybe one team needs 3 or 6 plays in a double or triple overtime game to score or not score, and the other team needs the same, and they just have the same result. So the short answer to your question is no. I don't like the fact that starting with the 3rd overtime, you have to go for 2. I'd like to see it ideally. Ideally, I'd like to see it just continue infinitely. At some point, one team's going to score because you got a field goal or a touchdown, and the other team's not going to score. But ideally, I think I'd like to see a minimum of 3 overtime swap possessions from the 25-yard line before they start getting gimmicky.
Yeah, because Victor, let's not forget, it was because one of those games that you're talking about was the game a couple of years ago in Penn State. It was the Penn State Illinois game, I believe, where they went back and forth like 8 times on the 2-point conversion.
Yep.
And because the offenses was so bad, they couldn't even score on the 2-point conversion. So no matter how they were trying to gimmick their way to end the game, that still didn't even make any sense. So that
By the way, that also happened. I think it was 8 or 9 overtimes that went that way in an Iowa preseason game between the A squad and B squad.
Good one,
Victor.
Hey, I don't mind. The more overtime periods, the better in college football. They've said it before. I'll say it again. College overtime is where unders go to die. Unless you're talking about the Big Ten, unless you're talking about the Big Ten conference, right? Because then you could be playing for a long, long time. I was very surprised about that USC game. You do realize that Arizona outstatted the Trojans by almost 150 yards in that particular game. The over-under was 69.5. It was tied 28-28 going into the first overtime. And because of all the matching of the scores, they still combined for 84 points in this particular game. Thank God it was a couple of high-scoring Pac-12 teams and not a Big Ten team like Andy was referring to. That's for sure.
Well, you could dismiss, I think, the thought, at least on the Southern Cal part of the football game, that perhaps they were looking ahead to the Notre Dame game. They played down to Arizona's level, but I think that's hogwash and garbage because it was a conference game. I think what happened more in the football game is the fact that the Southern Cal, or this USC defense, I should say, is being exposed, is being horrific. And teams like Arizona were able to take advantage of a situation like that. And like you say, Victor, top them, beat them by 150 yards in the contest. There's no excuse for that if you think you're a college football playoff team. I think what happened in that football game is the Trojans were exposed in a contest like that. But to answer your
remember,
question,
Mark, excuse me.
Yes.
That happened the week before in that game against Colorado where they had a nice lead and Colorado came all the way back, lose 48-41 in a game that, 21, 24-point deficit at one point. So that's 2 weeks in a row. They have no excuses.
No excuses, none whatsoever. But to Greg's point, my answer to overtime, whether it's the National Football League, whether it's college football, whether it's soccer, whether it's hockey, to me is just simple. Play on. Just let them play the game, and somebody's going to win that game. Forget all the rules and all the 2 points and got to do this. In the National Hockey League, you got to play with 3 men against 3 men. In soccer, you're down to shootouts. Does a shootout really, if somebody wins a shootout and they advance, does that really tell you the true worth of who deserved to win that game?
No. As a hockey fan, Mark, and I was going to bring that up anyway, most hockey fans now can't stand the shootout anymore. They just don't want it. They'd rather you just go an extra couple of minutes to just keep it going. And if you have to even tie the game, tie it. But nobody likes a shootout anymore.
No, and so eliminate all that garbage. Play to win the game. So you're tied after the end of regulation. Play to win the game. The National Football League does what they do. The first team scores on their first possession, they win. I don't know if I like that or not because they won a coin flip. It should probably maybe be a little bit evened up where the first team scores, the other team has a chance to counter, regardless of whether it was the first possession or not. But eventually somebody's going to score and somebody's not. And that's going to be the end of the football game. There's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser, and there won't be any ties. I think
tennis gets it right. Even in Wimbledon, didn't they have that multi-marathon a few years ago where they just kept playing? You got to win by 2 points when you play that 7th set.
Yep.
When it's tied 6-6 and you keep playing until one player wins 8-6 or like 29-27 or whatever it was.
Where they have a 2-point advantage within the match. Exactly.
Yes.
So I say get rid of all the garbage. Let's play the game and let the winner win the football game.
All right. Speaking of USC, Notre Dame, Jim, who do you like?
Well, Notre Dame has played a lot of games in a row. They really have. I mean, they lost to Louisville, all that. I mean, there's you could put knocks on either one of these teams at this point. And you look at the defense for USC the last couple of weeks, it's all valid. They have not looked good. and now they're going up, play Notre Dame on the road, and you're going to have weather there because you're talking about Indiana. So on the surface, you would say Notre Dame, but I'm not there. I really don't love the side. I'd probably take the dog if I could probably get 3. It could be very close.
Andy?
Yeah, I'm looking the same way because let's all remember that Notre Dame also has that transfer quarterback from Wake Forest who's been having an outstanding season for the Irish. But Jim, the first comments Jim made, they came off 3 tough games in a row. The loss in the final minute at home to Ohio State. The next week, the win on the final minute in the win at Duke. And then last week, the loss at Louisville in game in which Louisville really pretty much led wire to wire in that one. But that takes a lot out of you, even in an elite program, even though they are young kids. But at the same time, Southern Cal does have some deficiencies to be concerned about. You could excuse the Colorado one to the extent that, well, they had a comfortable lead and they were, never thought that they'd be in a position where it would be a one-score game. That should have gotten their attention for the game last week at home against Arizona. So there are some issues. That being said, Notre Dame's chance at a national title is pretty much over. I mean, next year, maybe with 2 losses, you're under consideration when the playoffs expand to 12 teams, and Notre Dame could go 10-2 next year, or like they might do this year. On the other hand, USC, has a legitimate chance again of making it to the college football playoff, being undefeated, although they still have some tough tests ahead of them, and then the Pac-12 championship game. So Notre Dame is reduced to being a spoiler. And right now, USC is in a position to have their season spoiled. That being said, if I can get +3 with the Trojans, that's the way I'm playing.
By the way, Marcus Freeman just 1-5 against the spread as a home favorite. So there's that. Victor, before you give me your analysis on the game, what did you think the spread was going to be?
Well, again, I'm the totals guy. I anticipated a spread somewhere in the low 60s. And we're right around 60 as we speak. With that said, I actually think there's a little bit of value on the under. It's tough to say that when you're talking about a USC defense that's been as bad as it has. But I'm concerned. Andy touched on Sam Hartman, the transfer from Wake Forest. Man, he came out of the gate blazing in the first couple of games of the season, a couple of 40-point outings right out of the gate. But I'm concerned about the Notre Dame offense. 21 or less points in each of their last 3 games. They've lost 2 out of 3. Sam Hartman seems a little bit lost as well. I would lean under in the game, guys.
Mark, were you surprised at all that Notre Dame was a 2-point favorite?
I was a little bit surprised, Greg. I got to say that I thought the game was going to open up pick and let the odds makers just let the sharps decide which way the favorite was going to move in the game. I never saw the pick as an opener. And I think a lot of that point spread is largely based upon what happened to Southern Cal the week before, going into triple overtime against Arizona, and the fact that you had Notre Dame coming back home. And you also got to ask yourself, will the Irish lose back-to-back games in South Bend? Because their last home game was against Ohio State. So they're going to come with everything they've got in this football contest here. I like Notre Dame in the game. I'm just not crazy to have to lay points. If they would have been pick'em or plus, I'd have been on the Irish.
Andy? Yo, you're muted, Andy.
I just got up to take a look at the Westgate College Football Games of the Year from over the summer. And this, of course, was one of the ones that they did have a bettable point spread up. And, Mark, you were right. This game did open, or it was sitting there all summer, USC Notre Dame a pick'em.
There you go.
I
was surprised, yes.
Before I ask you about NFL, I got to ask you about what many people believe could be the biggest game of the weekend. I know it is out west, Jim. Oregon and Washington.
Well, yes, there's experts on this call that have better opinions on college than I do. I would tough. Take the points. Can I just say that out there? Just take the points.
Andy?
It's a toss-up game. We talk about these marquee games, but that's not always where the money is to be made. And you're better off looking at, other teams like the Tulanes of the world or Florida International or something, where the odds makers aren't as sharp. And These tough games, when you got matchups like this, they've analyzed them. They come out with sharp spreads, and not every spread is beatable.
Andy?
Yeah, when you get a matchup like this, you got two really outstanding offenses. Oregon has displayed a little better tendency to play defense as far as the numbers are concerned. Either team can win this game. Both teams are capable of taking the field and beating virtually any opponent they face. With that said, I'd have to take a look at taking the points with Oregon because it's just as likely that if they cover the spread, they'll win the game. If you like Washington, and I think Jim does this a lot, instead of laying the 3, play Washington on the money line. I'll likely play the game, but I'll certainly have to make sure that this line does not go any lower than the 3 where it's at now.
Vic?
With Oregon.
Well, again, it's all about the totals for me, guys, and this is one of the few that I will be betting over this week. 67.5. The bar is set really, really high. I'm not afraid that Oregon has gone 0-4 to the under in their last 4 games, considering they have not played a legitimate offense, and I consider Washington to have the best offense in all of college football. In fact, the only game that Oregon did play against a semi-decent offense was probably their second game against Texas Tech, a game that was 38-30 and went over the total. So again, despite their gaudy under numbers for Oregon, well, obviously you got to look to see who they have played to get to that 1-4 over/under record. And of course, Michael Penix, Washington, he's number 1 in terms of the Heisman Trophy odds currently right now. In fact, it's basically a 2-horse race between Caleb Williams and Michael Penix, the 2 Pac-12 schools, as far as the Heisman goes. And he's off of a little bit of a low-scoring game last week. So look for a big rebound at home, and I'm playing over 67.5.
So you're also suggesting Bo Nix has a chance to make it a threesome at the top of the Heisman Trophy ladder
does.
if he puts in a big effort with Oregon this week against Washington.
Absolutely. He could join the big boys with a big game.
Mark, Oregon
Yes.
is 2-7 against the spread their last 9 as a road dog. Who do you like in the game?
Well, I'll say this to that stat, Greg, is never in any of those 9 games did Oregon take the field playing with a loss from revenge when they were a 12-point favorite against this team last year and had the rug pulled out on them, as Washington did to Oregon last season.
And
in
Bo Nix
Oregon.
got hurt late in that game.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Exactly. So you have a big revenge aspect here for Oregon, staring them in the face here. And it also goes to something that I do within the well-oiled machine. And whenever you pair undefeated teams, I call it a collision course. And you get to game 5 or later in the season, you got 2 undefeated teams. You always look for the dog. You can make deeper cases for the dog, but you don't lay the favorite because the dogs come in with a chip on their shoulder. They've proven they're worthy enough to be an undefeated football team. So combine the revenge with the collision course. I'll be taking the points here.
You know, Mark, this is a situation that doesn't happen that frequently this deep into the season. It may happen in the Big Ten. But Oregon and Washington coming into the game, same conference, unbeaten. Would you look to perhaps, again, to have to make sure the number's decent, to go against both of these teams next week, the team that had its undefeated season spoiled and the team that we just got a leg up on the other undefeated team in the conference, or at least in this case, one of the other 2 teams with the SC in there as well?
Well, that would probably be the first look, Andy, but I think what's more important to the answer is who they're playing the next week. And, what kind of opponent, is an opponent have a reason to come to play? Is an opponent a defensively sound football team? But knee-jerk reaction would be to fade the winner of this football game next week.
Oregon might be the team to fade. They host a very good Washington State team the next week.
There you go.
And I believe Washington plays one of the Arizona teams next week, and they
Well, that would
host
be
Arizona State.
Okay.
Yeah, Washington is a 21-point favorite on the look-ahead line next week, and Oregon is a 14-point home favorite against Washington State on the look-ahead line.
And by the way, these 2 teams could face each other again in the Pac-12 championship game. Very possible. So
That too.
we have to keep that in mind. By the way, Victor, I was going to go to the NFL, but to wrap up, you brought up the schedule. So I'm going to ask this. Jim, is there a specific time of year? Because I was going over the games this week and I started realizing, well, all of a sudden I'm starting to look at who the teams have played this season. Like I've noticed where in certain games, well, wait a second, this one team might have lost 4 straight games, but look who they played. And the other team might have more wins and so forth and so on. It might look better, but look who they've played. Is there a certain point in the season where you take a look at the schedule and make it that much more important in your evaluation?
You're at that point.
Yeah.
Strength of schedule is a key factor in handicapping. Now, if you played a weak schedule and you did well against that weak schedule, you just have to say, well, there's nothing. They don't make the schedule. They went out on the field and they did their job against teams that are weak. Now, you don't always learn from that because there's so many things that happen in a football game. If they're winning every game by 30 points against a weak schedule, you don't really know how good they are because they haven't been tested. But when you start the season off against, like, for example, Dallas, I don't want to pick on Dallas all the time, but they beat the Giants. I think it was like 40-0 or something. In the first couple of games, they were like 64 to, I mean, they were winning everything like great. And then, throw them on the road against Arizona, and Arizona just pumped them. And then they came back home off of that, and they beat another team that was rather easy. And they went and wrote, and they got the real test on Sunday night against San Francisco. So now you have to say, well, how good is this team? They only beat bad teams. And when they went up against a really, really, really good team, they didn't show up at all. So now I look at, they're going up against the Chargers coming off a bye. Chargers are a very good team. They have a couple of injuries. Nobody likes their coach, but everybody loves their quarterback. And they're going to get some players back as well from injury. You have to say, well, does Dallas really deserve to be 2.5, 3-point favorite on the road?
Especially with the offensive coordinator that they had last year now on the Chargers sideline.
Kellen Moore.
Exactly.
Kellen Moore.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to mention
go ahead,
something,
Andy.
Greg. The beauty of football is also one of the greatest weaknesses of football, and that is every game means something because there are so few games, which means there are so few data points from which you can draw reasonable conclusions. Mark, I don't know if you do this in your database. I do it in mine. I keep separate statistics on how teams do against common opponents, whether they be in conference or out of conference. So I'll take a look. I'm trying to remember the example of the game this week that I took a look at. I think it was North Carolina State and Duke. And take a look, and I think they've had 2 or 3 common opponents. And I break it down not just into how they did score-wise, but what was the yardage, what was the yards per play, the rushing, et cetera. I get a little bit more of a meaningful assessment of those 2 teams relative just to each other by comparing them against teams that both teams have faced. Now, of course, there's still very few data points overall, and then when you break it down, home and road, injuries, etc., but at least it gives a little bit more meaningful bite to the analysis that you can spot where, and I think it was Duke having a nice edge against North Carolina. North Carolina State. I think they both played Notre Dame this year, and I think they both played UConn, and there may have been one other team, but I know it was those 2 at least. So I want to know, Mark, do you break things down? Because that's also part of when you talk about schedule difficulty and trying to assess the quality of who the teams have played and how they did.
I think common opponents is a great part of the handicapping, Andy, and it especially works real well, obviously, in the second half of the season when you've got more common opponents that you can weigh them against, especially in college football, the month of November, as the football teams get ready to prepare for bowl games, the National Football League, the month of December. But it's something that I automatically do is look at the common opponents and see exactly how they fared. Now, there are circumstances, as you said, in those games that happened originally. If you make notes about those circumstances, a team might not have had their starting quarterback, as a for instance, or a running back may have went down in the football game. So you can take all that with a grain of salt, but common opponent stats are critically important when it comes to handicapping.
That's a good segue into the NFL. Last couple of things before we move on, and I wanted to ask you guys. There are 2 first-year head coaches that have actually been pretty impressive so far. D'Amico Ryans for Houston and Jonathan Gannon for Arizona. I mean, I don't think anybody expected Arizona to play this tough with their quarterback situation, with what it is. So, Victor, long term, are you buying D'Amico Ryans or Jonathan Gannon?
Oh, I'm on the Houston bandwagon, man. I've been on the bandwagon, particularly Tuchel here with some of his team totals, basically from day one. Yes, they're only 2-3 on the season, but they're one of the few under 500 teams that have a plus scoring differential. They got the guy they wanted in CJ Stroud. I mean, we talked at the top of the show about how there's some dissension down there in Carolina between Tepper, the owner, and Frank Reich, the head coach, in terms of how dissatisfied their draft was. And it is the exact opposite in Houston. They love their head coach. They love their new defensive first-round player. They love their Ohio State quarterback. And I'm all in on the Texans, man.
Yeah, wasn't it in the draft process? I could have sworn there was I forget who it was, an assistant coach, and it might have been an assistant coach. I believe it was with Carolina, who's made some remark. I don't know if it was McCown who made a remark about, well, we'll see you in April or something like that. And everybody thought that was the tip that Carolina was going to be taking CJ Stroud. And then all of a sudden in the last week it changed. And then all of a sudden everybody started realizing, well, we thought that's where it was. So maybe that's exactly what we're hearing now. Is that maybe Frank Reich did want him. Maybe that was where they were going to go. But then the owner intervened. And it was his call.
That's what I think I heard today in the press conference. I know Andy followed that as well, but that's what it seems like McCown and Frank Reich wanted Stroud, and David Tepper, who's a very strong-willed man, that wanted the other guy, and that they, of course, they're going to go with what he says.
By the way, don't you guys think it's way too early to judge whether CJ Stroud or Bryce Young is the better quarterback?
It is, but we constantly we have to make these assessments on a week-to-week basis if we're betting these games. Now, the question you brought up, Gannon versus DeMeco Ryan, it's not as easy a question to answer as you might think, aside from the fact that it's only been 5 games, because DeMeco Ryan has done tremendous, in Houston with a first-year quarterback. Well, Gannon has done much better than expected, especially with some of the players that they gave up on before the season, considering he's effectively got a first-year quarterback in Dobbs with no Kyler Murray. So the challenges faced by both head coaches are fairly even in many respects, and I generally prefer defensive coaches for the most part. Because if you can keep your opponent from scoring, you can't lose a game. Of course, your offense has to score, and that's usually, going to happen as well. But both of these, and Jim pointed out what the Eagles have missed in Gannon's departure from the defense, because this was considered before the start of the season maybe one of the best NFL defenses over the past decade with what they had and what they acquired in the draft. So his absence or his departure has been felt. They're starting to make adjustments now, but it shows just what a good coach the Cardinals had, and the coach with an offensive from a defense standpoint had to make some tough decisions with the offense, leaving that to the offensive coordinator, et cetera. So I think both teams have been and will continue to be very satisfied with their coaching decisions. But then again, as I mentioned earlier, I prefer the Houston organizational culture over the Arizona culture. But let's give the younger Bidwell a little bit more time in Arizona.
Hey, guys, I want to throw this in there while we're on the subject of C.J. Stroud and Bryce Young. We came across this over the course of the summer before or right after the National Football League draft. And they do these things now called S2 cognition tests on these athletes. Before it used to be the Wonderlic, and that sort of got outdated. And these S2 cognition tests are a little bit more responsive in evaluation of how they react to certain situations. So anyway, when they did them this year, the number one quarterback in college football this year that came out that had the highest S2 cognition rating at 98% was Bryce Young. The number 8 quarterback out of 8 quarterbacks that were reported was C.J. Stroud at 18%. So what does that mean? That means, do you take these cognition tests and throw them out the window because Stroud has really outperformed Bryce Young? Or is that just another metric that the National Football League loves to use when it comes to analyzing drafting quarterbacks?
Yeah, I guess that
Good
is something
question,
we're going to find out. And before I turn it back over to you, Mark, I just wanted to remind everybody about another trend that worked big time, and a trend that you can pick up into Playbook Preview Guide magazine, which was the dog in the Pittsburgh-Baltimore series, winning again. There it is, Victor, winning again.
Unbelievable. It wins again, and here Pittsburgh wins a football game, and they're atop the AFC North, and they've been out-yarded in every football game they played this year.
I'm wondering if we've ever seen a weekend or a week in the NFL where at one point during the game, the score was 10-3 and 10-5. And that happened both in the Pittsburgh-Baltimore game and the Jets-Denver game last week.
Ugly.
You know, there was a reason, guys, that I decided to use Pittsburgh plus the points as my top-rated selection in last week's Wise Guy contest.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I did.
And,
Nice one.
and we're going to have to take him again in what, a few weeks?
Right.
Yeah.
Mark it
Very
down. It's your show, Mark.